Hello, my name is Kenna, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phone. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Abel, Associate Professor of Military History.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So today we have a treat for you, not just because Dr. Martin Clemis is an expert in all things Vietnam, but because he is talking about something that the Army is very interested in and something that he has spent his professional career working on. It's this question of how we use data and what data tells us and how data is useful but also problematic in waging war. Dr. Clemis is the author of The Control War, among many other papers and chapters and other writings on Vietnam, both from the American side, but also from the North Vietnamese communist side. And so today he's going to talk to us about a topic, as I said, that the Army is very interested in today. Dr. Clemis?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Abel, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank the Dole Institute of Politics for putting on this wonderful series on technology and innovation in war. And of course, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to come out and see me today talk about data analysis and the Vietnam War. Now, before I get to the subject matter at hand, I just want to talk real briefly about this idea of military innovation. Now, the unending quest for supremacy over one's enemies is perhaps the single most important factor behind military innovation. The processes through which states and military organizations pursue new and novel ways to gain superiority are complex and occur in a number of key areas such as organization, training, doctrine, and even theories concerning the nature and purpose of war. Technology constitutes just a single element within a complex system of interrelated variables. Nonetheless, technology permeates and, in fact, governs everything in war, from tactics, operations and strategy, to logistics, intelligence, command and control, and communication. Now, modern war has become so large and complex that it defies the ability of policymakers and commanders to survey or comprehend it in its totality. Within this context, the need for information, both quantitative and qualitative data, is imperative. The means of collecting, collating, analyzing, and disseminating quantitative and qualitative data for the purposes of war have evolved over time, from the development of the Prussian General Staff in the 19th century to the use of microprocessors and large language models by virtually every military on the planet today. Now, the Vietnam War and the Pentagon's extensive use of data and data analysis was an important part of this evolution. The sheer amount of data that was collected and analyzed for the war in Vietnam is mind-numbing. Moreover, it is unparalleled in the history of warfare. Now, ever since Copernicus advanced his theory of heliocentrism in the 16th century, humans have increasingly embraced a rationalistic, scientific, and technocentric view of the world. By the early 19th century, Western nations were awash with definitive systems intended to regulate every field of human activity, including war. The wars of Napoleon spawned a new generation of military theorists, including Archduke Charles, tongue twister, Antoine Henry Jomini, and others, who looked to reason, empiricism, and mathematical truth to uncover universal principles and create positive doctrines. Inspired by the intellectual twin engines of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the overall goal was to make war rational, scientific, and hence more controllable. Now, in the early 20th century, military science merged with the burgeoning managerial and technocratic revolutions that were taking the world by storm. Managers and technicians were looking to fix and perfect productive industrial systems using logic, quantitative methods, and deductive reasoning. The overall goal was to better manage large and complex organizations, be they corporations, bureaucratic institutions, or armed forces. The means were technical expertise, specialized procedures, and data-driven decision-making. Now, one of the first people to advance such an approach was Frederick Taylor Winslow, an American industrialist and mechanical engineer who looked to improve industrial efficiency and productivity through systematic analysis and adjustment of work processes. The method he created was called scientific management, or Taylorism, as it came to be popularly known. Now, Taylorism was appealing to the United States military. The U.S. Army and the Navy adopted scientific management to improve efficiency at arsenals and Navy yards. The United States implemented scientific management on a national scale during World War I, and on a transnational scale a quarter of a century later. The unprecedented size and scope of World War II, along with its highly industrialized character, reinforced the utility of scientific management. For the United States, the challenges of the war were overwhelming. These included raising, sustaining, and equipping massive military forces, manning billion-dollar budgets, producing mountains of military equipment and supplies, not only for American forces, but for our allies, coordinating combined arms warfare on a global scale, and balancing competing demands for scarce resources, both human and material. Large-scale industrialized warfare demanded new techniques, new methods, and new ideas. Operations research was one of these methods. Rooted in the ethos of scientific management, operations research can be defined as the analytical study of military problems to define scientific bases for decision-making and improved military operations. Operations research was designed to identify problems and promote solutions. It was reliant, therefore, heavily on data collection and data analysis. Statistics provided the foundation for identifying problem areas, making necessary corrections, distributing resources effectively, and measuring results. Scientific management was adopted by the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Army Service Forces, which consisted of logistics, personnel, finance, and technical services such as the Quartermaster, Corps of Engineers, and the Ordnance Department. Now, statistical control became a cornerstone of operations research. The Office of Statistical Control was created in 1942 as a key organization within the U.S. Army Air Corps. Its purpose was to improve the efficacy and efficiency of strategic bombing through statistical analysis. Now, the Office of Statistical Control was headed by Colonel Charles Tex Thornton. Born in 1913, Thornton earned an electrical engineering degree at Texas Tech University and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. He joined the Army Air Corps in World War II and was personally chosen to lead the Statistical Control Group by the Assistant Secretary of War for Air, Robert Lovett. Now, more than 15,000 statistical officers with backgrounds in business, banking, data processing, and higher education served during the war. Of these, roughly 3,000 were trained at the Harvard Business School. One of the individuals educated at Harvard and employed by the Office of Statistical Analysis, was Robert Strange McNamara, a future Secretary of Defense and the central character in the story that we are telling here today. Now, McNamara was born in San Francisco in 1916. He earned a BA in economics with minors in mathematics and philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley in 1927. 1937. 2 years later, he earned an MBA from Harvard Business School, and the following year, he was hired to teach at Harvard. And he was, in fact, at that time, the youngest tenured professor ever to teach at Harvard. In World War II, he served as a statistical officer in the Army Air Forces in both the European and Pacific theaters under General Curtis LeMay. McNamara and statistical analysis played a crucial role in refining Air Force operations, rendering them more efficient and effective. After the defeat of Germany and Japan, McNamara, Thornton, and other statistical savvy officers brought the gospel of optimization, efficiency, and statistical control back home. Now, in 1946, McNamara, Thornton, and 10 other former statistical officers were hired by Ford Motor Company to turn it around. At that time, it was facing lackluster sales and significant financial losses. Collectively known as the Whiz kids, they used the data-driven analytical methods they learned at Harvard and perfected during the war. Quantitative data and statistical analysis was also used to develop modern management systems and revamp financial and accounting practices, as well as in the production of new automobile models and the development of novel safety features such as seatbelts, padded dashboards, and safety glass. Now, over time, McNamara, Thornton, and the Whiz kids transformed Ford into a highly profitable and thoroughly modern corporation. In fact, in 1960, Ford appointed McNamara to be the president of the company, which was unprecedented because he was the first non-Ford family member to ever serve as president. However, this would be short-lived. A few weeks after this happened, he was tapped by the Kennedy administration to serve as Secretary of Defense. Now, McNamara and his analytical approach fit hand in glove with Kennedy and his administration. On the one hand, there was a degree of continuity with the Kennedy administration and that of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were cold warriors committed to containing communism and promoting democracy and economic progress abroad. They also prioritized a strong military. On the other hand, Kennedy, McNamara, and the other new frontiersmen represented a sharp break with the past. One area was national security policy. They rejected Eisenhower's New Look policy, which was founded on deterrence through strategic nuclear weapons and air power. And instead, they favored a policy advanced by General Maxwell Taylor known as flexible response, which called for a more flexible national security establishment that could fight along the conflict spectrum, from small guerrilla wars or brushfire wars, as Kennedy called them, to mid-intensity conflict, to large-scale conventional and even atomic war. And this shift to flexible response is one of the things that will draw the United States into the war in Vietnam. Now, the Kennedy administration was also highly idealistic. They believed that the United States had a special role in the world, as well as the means to contain communism, to create a peaceful and stable world order, and to help the developing world modernize. There was also a youthful vitality and optimism to this administration, and if you've ever heard, and I'm sure you all have, Kennedy's inaugural address, you get a sense of that youthful optimism. There was also an unprecedented degree of intellectualism. Kennedy openly courted scholars and academics to actively participate in the affairs of the nation. They were also willing to try new approaches and to include people from outside the traditional pool, of Washington power brokers. Kennedy appointed many of these outsiders, a lot of them academics in particular, to the highest levels of the federal government. By far, McNamara was the most brilliant star in what David Halberstam called the best and the brightest of a generation. They carried with them, Halberstam wrote of the New Frontiersmen, an exciting sense of American elitism, a sense that the best men had been summoned forth from the country to harness this dream to a new American nationalism, bringing a new, strong, dynamic spirit to our historic role in world affairs. Now, McNamara and other Ivy League educated defense intellectuals, including National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and his deputy, Walt W. Ristow, were determined to reforge the Department of Defense in their own highly intellectual and analytical image. Moreover, they were determined to run the National Security Council and the Department of Defense in their own way. War, after all, was too important to be left to the generals, they believed. Aside from being the most intelligent Secretary of Defense in American history, McNamara was also the most powerful. He was supremely confident, almost to the point of arrogance, and highly ambitious. Thanks to a piece of legislation signed into law by his predecessor, McNamara concentrated power in the office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, under Eisenhower, the 1958 Defense Reorganization Act, it strengthened the role of the Secretary of Defense, it centralized authority in the Secretary's office, and expanded the Secretary's control over budget, personnel, as well as strategic and operational decisions. It also removed the Joint Chiefs from the chain of command and curtailed the independence of the military services. Kennedy and later Lyndon Johnson gave McNamara carte blanche to run the Department of Defense and the Pentagon, and he took full advantage of it, exercising increasing control over what were historically military prerogatives. Now, between 1955 and 1972, a long time, the United States did not wage a single war in Southeast Asia, but many different wars. The Vietnam War was a complex and ever-evolving mixture of conventional combat operations, guerrilla warfare, nation-building, diplomacy, and mass politics. Now, essentially, there were four primary lines of effort for the United States over this span of time. Under Eisenhower and Kennedy, it was largely to provide advice and support to help the South Vietnamese develop its own military forces for self-defense. Under Lyndon Johnson, there was a strategic air war against North Vietnam to degrade their military capabilities and convince Hanoi to abandon its efforts to conquer the South. There was also a simultaneously combined ground and air campaign in South Vietnam, which was implemented to destroy communist guerrillas and main forces which had come down from North Vietnam. And lastly, certainly not leastly, there was a pacification program which was meant to help the Saigon government build its social, economic, and political institutions and gain popular support. You've all heard the common phrase, winning hearts and minds, right? This was what nation building and pacification was all about. Vietnam was also a war without front lines, and unlike anything the nation had ever experienced before. You can see here a quote by William Westmoreland. "Statistics were admittedly an imperfect gauge of progress, yet in the absence of conventional front lines, how else to measure it?" Right? Now, the thing about Vietnam, and the center photo in this slide kind of really captures this. Rather than be separated behind front lines, friendly and enemy forces were commingled. And moreover, areas and levels of either government or insurgent control were interspersed and were constantly in flux, going back and forth under the control of one or the other. The operational environment of South Vietnam was also highly complex and fragmented. There were 4 military regions, 44 provinces, 252 districts, nearly 2,500 villages, more than 11,000 hamlets. There was also, if you look on your left-hand side, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a conduit, a pipeline which brought manpower and material down from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia to keep the insurgency going in the south. And the picture on your right, there was also a constellation of base areas interspersed not only in Laos and Cambodia and along the border, but inside of South Vietnam itself. So again, this was a highly complex and fragmented operational environment. And that meant that such complexity, right, meant the traditional metrics for measuring war, like those that were used in World War II or in Korea, were largely inapplicable here in Vietnam. Now, discussing the full scope on the use of data and data analysis in the Vietnam War would be impossible within multiple, let alone a single lecture. Therefore, I will focus on systems analysis as it was applied to 2 specific areas, the pacification program and Westmoreland's big unit war of attrition. And here you could see is kind of an informal definition of pacification. It was the military, political, economic, and social processes of establishing or reestablishing local government in response to and involving the participation of the people. Again, this is essentially nation building. Right? Now, in order for that to happen, in order for the pacification to progress at all, there was nothing you can build. There wasn't an election you could hold without a secure environment and security. And this is what really the reason why American combat forces are sent to South Vietnam in 1965, ground forces, to supply that security bubble, or to provide a shield, if you will, made available by U.S. combat power, behind which pacification would progress. So the other element was this big unit war of attrition, Westmoreland's War of Attrition, and that was offensive combat operations to either destroy or expel communist main forces from South Vietnam. Search and destroy was a common term for these types of operations. And these are the two areas in which I'm going to go into some detail on the way data was used and the way data was collected. Now, systems analysis was the foundation of what came to be known as the McNamara Revolution, a method that used applied economic models, statistical measures, and scientific methods to improve policy and decision-making at the Pentagon. McNamara first implemented systems analysis under the Kennedy administration to make the Department of Defense more efficient, cost-effective, and to address the ambiguities and complexities of maintaining a global national defense posture during the Cold War. Once Johnson had sent combat forces to South Vietnam, systems analysis was used to cut through the fog of war by providing policymakers and combatant commanders a timely and steady stream of information as it related to the operational environment in South Vietnam. Now, the Southeast Asia Programs Division Systems Analysis, I'll call it here the Systems Analysis Division, was created for these very purposes, to provide data for policymakers and combatant commanders. Housed within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, it was responsible for collecting, collating, and analyzing defense-related data and publishing intelligence reports based upon that information. The organization was led by a systems analyst named Thomas C. Thayer, who was an Ivy League graduate with a master's degree in business administration, another big brain or a best and the brightest, much like McNamara and the others. Now, under Thayer, the Systems Analysis Division generated millions of reports on every aspect of the war in Vietnam, including enemy numbers and activity, the efficacy of Allied ground forces and naval operations, appraisals of the air war, the combat effectiveness of the South Vietnamese military forces, the war's impact on civilians, the costs of the war, economic development throughout South Vietnam, the status of local elections in the villages and hamlets, land reform, agricultural issues, and the attitudes and aspirations of the South Vietnamese people themselves. Right, so it was all the beans that could possibly be counted in a war without front lines. A war for the people was, in fact, counted. Now, another key statistic, right, another key area that was covered by the Southeast Asia analysis reports was friendly and enemy casualty rates. And here you can see a chart on communist deaths in South Vietnam, the infamous body count. Now, according to Douglas Kennard, right, who was a U.S. Army officer, there's a quote up here from him. When all else is forgotten about statistical reporting in the Vietnam War, the body count will be remembered. Now, sadly, this quote is accurate. Although the United States military used many hundreds of metrics and dozens of reporting systems to measure every aspect of the war in Vietnam, body count is often discussed as if it was the only or even the most important metric that was used to gauge progress in this war, and that simply was not the case. With no capitals to capture or front lines to measure, one of the few ways to determine progress in Westmoreland's big unit war of attrition was to count the number of enemy forces killed in action. Ghoulish, yes, but also understandable. Body count was in line with the American strategy and Washington's end state for fighting the Vietnam War, which was to preserve an independent, self-sufficient, non-communist South Vietnam. The purpose of U.S. combat forces was to break the enemy's will, to modify their behavior and convince Hanoi and the National Liberation Front that they could not win and to abandon their efforts to conquer the South Vietnamese regime. Using rational actor theoretical models, McNamara believed there was a threshold or crossover point that could be reached with American firepower. The intention was to kill communist soldiers in the South at levels that were either unsustainable or unacceptable. The United States also fought strictly on the strategic defense in the ground war. They were forbidden from launching ground invasions into Laos, Cambodia, or North Vietnam, despite the fact that those areas were extensively used by the communists to continue their efforts to topple the Saigon regime year after year. McNamara's solution, therefore, was an incremental approach built on applied economic models and cost-benefit analyses rather than traditional military principles such as concentration, mass, and initiative. Now, body count has been highly criticized over the years, and in a lot of cases, there's good reason for that. First and foremost, the numbers were unreliable. It was oftentimes hard to tell in a war amongst the people who was a combatant and who was not a combatant. Also, there was never a direct correlation, a one-for-one correlation, if you will, between weapons recovered and bodies that were recovered. Oftentimes, they would find no bodies. So it was highly problematic. Another thing about body count, it was prone to inflation. The incentive structures for commanders and advisors in South Vietnam was to show progress. So at times, they would pad the numbers to show this progress, to support the Johnson's policy on Vietnam, or whatever it might be, promotion, right? Just leaving theater and going on to your next billet, right? The numbers were, in fact, inflated by advisors and military officers. And the last, and perhaps this is the most important, body count failed to gauge the most important metric of the war, which was Hanoi's will to continue fighting, something that they did eventually to the point where they, A, drove the United States from the war and then conquered our ally after we had been beaten out of South Vietnam, if you will, or out of Southeast Asia. Now, data analysis was also extensively used to assess the pacification program. Now, the Hamlet Evaluation System, or HES, was first introduced in 1967 to measure pacification progress. It was designed to yield comprehensive, quantifiable data on the security and development of every hamlet in South Vietnam. HES was a fully automated system that relied on computer processing and the collection and standardization of data on approximately 11,000 to 13,000 hamlets. Monthly and quarterly questionnaires conducted by military advisors in the villages and hamlets were the foundation for the program. Now, monthly questionnaires contained 25 questions. Quarterly questionnaires contained 56 hamlet-level questions and 58 village-level questions. HES aggregated the survey data into centralized computer databases and then presented them as quantitative outputs in a series of analytical reports. Between 1967 and 1972, the program produced more than 4.3 million pages of information, each containing anywhere from 10 to 20 or more data elements. Now, HES analyzed pacification along two broad categories, security and development. Those related to development addressed local administration, political and economic activity, community development projects, public health, education, land tenure, things such as that. Those that related to security focused on the activities of both friendly and enemy forces, and you could see there are some samples up here that I had provided, right? And they're really questions on asking, when has the enemy been around? What have they been up to? Have they had any activity in this village or this hamlet during the month? Same thing with friendly forces as well. So this is what the kind of security questions that were asked of these villagers and which were collected later on. Now, once these questions were answered, right? Pacification advisors then tabulated the answers to these questions on scorecards, right? And you can see two of those up here right now for both the hamlet and villages, right? And they fed this data into a computer. Once these scorecards were put into a computer, they produced a wide range of media formats, such as graphs, charts, spreadsheets, diagrams, and maps, such as the one that is shown here. And then these were distributed to policymakers and combatant commands. And here you can kind of get a sense of how they were determining levels of control by either the government or the insurgency. Right? As you can see here, the pink kind of letters were those hamlets that were deemed under government control. Those that were in blue were considered contested, which were a mixture of enemy and friendly competition for control of a given hamlet. Those that were in green, D and E, meant they were under communist influence or heavy communist influence, and those which were in red, V-rated Hamlets, were those that were under direct communist control. And as you can see, it's all intermixed and interspersed in this, making it very hard for policymakers and combatant commands to determine a course of action to solve a Rorschach kind of problem such as this. Now, population security and population control were considered the heart of the Hamlet evaluation system. And I have a quote up here by McNamara himself, who says, "Perhaps the best single measure of pacification is the extent to which the population has been brought under government control and protection." And as you can see here by the numbers, and there's a lot of numbers up there, but the only ones you really want to focus on is the secure and the communist control, because the secure was going up over time and communist control was going down over time. So it looked like there was a degree of progress that was going on. Now, even before HES, the old standardized kind of information assessment, also you saw a similar trend. After the introduction of US combat forces in '65, the security levels started going up. But again, there were issues and problems with that, which I'll go into in a little bit. But as you could see, between 1967 and 1972, according to HES and the data that was collected, 8.2 million people went into the secure category. And the percentage of the population living in secured areas during that period rose from 42% to 80%. Right? Population control was very similar to population security. And here's a quote from Thayer: "The most important objective of both sides in a war without fronts is control over the population. Influence over population and support from it is what such a war is all about." Right, now, by 1972, the percentage of South Vietnamese population living in secured areas had increased up to 90% as well. Now, again, this was not just a question of numbers and quantitative data. There was also a degree of qualitative data which went into these assessments as well, too. But that being said, there were a number of criticisms concerning the Hamlet evaluation system and the numbers that they generated. Now, the first one is that these numbers were prone to inflation. Again, much like body count, there was an incentive structure inside of South Vietnam, both for the South Vietnamese and the American military, to pad the numbers to show progress. The categories, whether they were secure, relatively secure, or contested, were impossible to gauge accurately, and they were often malleable, and it depended on who was looking at them, whatever individual agency was looking at this data as well, too. MACV and the Department of Defense tended to be more pessimistic about their assessments. Optimistic about their assessments. Meanwhile, the State Department and the CIA tended to be more pessimistic, right? So oftentimes, it was in the eye of the beholder. Now, the validity of HES was also concerning. People were asking questions: could it accurately measure what it was designed to measure? Right, with its methodology and its accuracy. Indicators were often average, right, which could skew the overall score of an individual Hamlet, either one way or the other. And the last one is that numbers were never really permanent. They were in a constant state of flux, and they were subject to sudden reversal should the communists launch another kind of large invasion. Right, but nonetheless, many believe the Hamlet evaluation system was a useful tool that accurately measured general trends in both security and development in South Vietnam. So what utility did data collection and data analysis hold during the Vietnam War? And this question is hard to answer. On one hand, data analysis was good at illuminating the general trends of the war, and it was also useful in post-war analysis to look at those trends and kind of retrospectively kind of understand what was going on when oftentimes, while it was going on, people were not sure, right? Again, the fog of war helps kind of retrospectively cut through the fog of war. At the same time, however, it did not change policy or strategy at all for the United States, and the outcome of the war is another indicator. The United States ends up losing this war, despite all this data collection, all this data analysis to be applied to operations and strategy. So overall, data analysis in the Vietnam War was subject to a number of weaknesses, or suffered from a number of weaknesses. First one is that data collection trumped data analysis. They were counting a lot of stuff, but there was not a lot of deep analysis on what that was. Every bean that could have been counted was counted. However, real analytical work onto figuring out which metrics were important or how to effectively create a policy to address those, that never happened. So data collection trumped analysis. There were also too many metrics. They were counting way too many things, which often obscured or marginalized meaningful measurement and assessment of the things that really mattered. Was often lost because in just so many millions and millions of data points. Staffs and commanders were overwhelmed. The data was overwhelming. They were unable to simply make sense or put to effective use the oceans of data that they were producing during the Vietnam War. They were also highly subject and prone to misinterpretation or, as we've discussed several times now, manipulation by the individuals that were involved. Inflation occurred as pressures to demonstrate progress. And this at times created a false sense of security. And last, and again, this is one of the most important aspects of this, they could not analyze the intangibles, will, motivation, and morale. And this was a political war for the hearts and minds. And the things that you simply could not measure is oftentimes very important, or it is very important in war. You just simply can't count everything that matters. So what does this mean for today? More than any time in history, we live in an information age. And today, the United States Army, like its sister services, is working to create a data-literate force, one that can not only collect, process, and analyze data, but also use it to improve military decision-making at every level. The need for a data-literate military, is understandable and appropriate. And as you can see, right, the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army is taking this very seriously. Right? They believe that data and the ability to have a data-literate force is of strategic importance. Right? And it goes back to, again, to rapid and timely decision-making to produce better military outcomes. Nonetheless, history and the Vietnam War in particular provide important insights and caveats for the future fight. First, the data collected for the purposes of war will never be complete. There are always lacunas that demand human judgment to fill the gaps. Next, data is prone to manipulation, misinterpretation, and amplification. Objective numbers are always filtered through a subjective bias, being an individual, an institution, so on and so forth, an administration. Third, the speed and volume at which data can be collected, collated, and disseminated, thanks now to AI and microprocessors, can easily overwhelm policymakers and commanders to the point of inertia. Right? It's great that you can collect more data, but now you got to go through all that stuff and make sense of it and somehow use it productively. And then finally, data cannot capture the unquantifiable, the moral, psychological, and intangible aspects of war, which are equal, if not often more important than its tangible aspects. And I'm going to finish up with a quote here because I think it's great. This was shared by a colleague of mine, Jeff Babb, in an article. And what this individual, Andrew Latham, says is that the lessons of the past remind us that while technology will continue to evolve, the essence of warfare will remain rooted in human nature. We must resist the temptation to overstate the impact of technology and instead focus on the human element that has always defined warfare. The future of warfare may be shaped by technology, but it will always be fought by humans. Thank you very much. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. Did the data-driven reports on ARVN effectiveness support Nixon's decision to shift the burden of combat operations to the Vietnamese?
That's a good question, and I would answer that it probably did not. Just as those indicators of increasing security was something that was used by the Nixon administration to not only justify Vietnamization, but also American withdrawal as well, too. And even before the HES existed, the Johnson administration did a victory lap in the summer and fall of 1967 based upon metrics showing, right, of improved outlook to say progress, and then the Tet Offensive happens, and the American people get punched in the face by reality. So, as did Johnson and McVie. Thanks. Sir.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. I have a question about the no front lines aspect of it. Now, as I understand it, the American solution to this was to assign companies, discrete companies, to different strategic hamlets who did their best to hold them and to patrol around them. So what you have there is a conventional force supporting irregular warfare as a policy on a very large scale. Now, my question is really about the other side. If the U.S. was putting companies in strategic hamlets and sitting there, what was the North Vietnamese army doing? Were they also assigning areas to companies to just wander around and do their best to disrupt the Americans? And also, you described these base camps. Do you have real regular force units there? Are there whole regiments there? And so basically, you have the policymakers in Hanoi. You have basically special forces running around on the ground. What do you have in between those two things?
Okay, no, that's a great question. And one of the reasons why the Vietnam War was so hard to figure out is because it was also a hybrid war as well, in which it was a mixture of conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare. You had political grassroots kind of subversion going on at the same time as well. So when it came to the grassroots level, this is where the National Liberation Front played a strong role, where the local guerrillas would be at the kind of district or the village or hamlet level. Meanwhile, the larger North Vietnamese army forces, and even the National Liberation Front early on at least, had main forces as well too, who were large and organized along conventional lines. I mean, they were essentially light infantry, but it's really the way that they were organized. And those two worked in tandem with one another to operate, both in the kind of sparsely populated rural areas. That's where the big units were at, to try to draw the Americans out, and then the local guerrillas and everything in the village and hamlet level as well too. And they kind of, Westmoreland used an analogy to describe those two. One was bully boys and one was termites, right? And they're both attacking the House of South Vietnam. But they operated very differently in very different areas as well, too. So the United States and South Vietnam had to adjust themselves to meet that hybrid threat. We had our own large conventional forces, as did ARVN, who fought the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front, or VC, main forces. And then they had what were known as territorial forces to fight the guerrillas. And then we also had, as you pointed out, kind of the Combined Action Platoon program and other things in which they were embedding at those lower levels as well. So yeah, highly complex and many, many things going on at the same time. So.
Yes, from the start, I was questioning the accuracy of data collection. Today, you can put, optical readers and et cetera, but back then, it was much more subjective in the eye of the beholder. And the HES, when you start looking at it, if a hamlet is under the control of the AVN, how accurate are the responses to those questions? Do they want to mislead us? And so how, if at all, did the military and the politicians try to adapt to those inaccuracies which were inevitable, or were they blind to them?
Right. No, I mean, that's a great question. And the thing about the Hamlet evaluation system is that it comes out in 1967, and it's used all the way until we leave, and we kind of hand it over to the South Vietnamese after the war. But while the United States is in charge of this thing, it underwent several iterations to try to squeeze out as much of the subjective aspects of the program as they could and make it as objective as they could possibly be. But you're absolutely correct, right? In a war like this, in and amongst the civilian population, oftentimes they're going to say whoever's asking questions wants to hear, right? The people walking around with the guns, they're going to tend to follow and cooperate with those people simply because they're on the spot. So they're oftentimes, it was hard to tell if they were being truthful with you about whatever issues you might have been asking them. Also, Rand had done an extensive study on the Viet Cong motivation and morale. They had study after study after study, and even that was proven to be problematic because the truth of the questioning is going to be possibly slanted due to the unequal power relations between who's asking the questions and who's answering the questions. So Yeah, they try to make it as subjective as possible. I'm sorry, objective as possible, but there's always going to be that degree of subjectivity. And I think even today, with AI and everything else, as we know, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? AI is not, contrary to what my father-in-law thinks, just like a truth speaker, right? It tells you what the people who program it, you know, it's steered towards a particular answer, I'm going to say, right? It's not completely objective in its answers. So, thank you. Sir?
Yeah, you mentioned the Tet Offensive, but as a result of that, it was believed that the Viet Cong had really been pretty much taken a big defeat. Strategically, we took a black eye, but they were tactically very weakened. What did the stats show, or did they try and pursue that after the Tet Offensive?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there is truth to the fact that after Tet, that there is a downtick in the severity of the war, right? They're severely damaged. They're not destroyed by any means. But the only thing that keeps the Southern Insurgency, or one of the things that keeps it going, is that large North Vietnamese Army units are being broken down to keep those NLF units in the South going. And the numbers, if you look at 1971, that start when you get really good. The war dips down to a super kind of quiet level, almost unprecedented. And there's a large degree of qualitative data to back that up as well, too. People are able to, work the rice fields, get their agriculture to market. The economy is doing pretty well. People are buying television sets and radios in the countryside. They're starting to electrify the countryside. So there is a certain degree of kind of a peaceful period. And Tet has a lot to do with that. It's also, they put in the accelerated pacification program as well. So part of that good situation in 1970 or 71 was due partly for what the United States and South Vietnam was doing, which was this accelerated pacification emphasis under Abrams. But on the other hand, those numbers were also good because not only the National Liberation Front, but Hanoi had to just simply lay low for a few years before it could. So they were actually, their activity dipped as well. So it was partly what the Allies were doing and partly inactivity on the part of Hanoi as well, too, which explains those high security numbers at that time. Sir.
Thank you. This is mind-boggling at first glance. This is my introduction to this, but is your opinion that this was a good first step in terms of data analysis and collection, or was it a waste of time?
No, I mean, that's a great question, too. I don't believe it was a waste of time, right? I mean, even if things fail, there's no guarantees to anything. But given the unprecedented nature of this conflict for the United States, the no front lines, the hybrid nature, the fact that it's political, the fact that what was going on in one region was so different from places right next to it. It was just so confusing and complex. This is one way to try to get to that, right? I mean, in Korea and World War II, you can modify, you could watch which direction the front line was moving, right? Whether you were taking ground or losing ground, whether you were destroying more enemy units than they were destroying of you and taking capitals or so on and so forth. Here, you couldn't do that. By the time the United States arrives, there's already a hybrid insurgency which has metastasized, to various different degrees and levels throughout all of South Vietnam. So they're fighting an area war, like a war in 360 degrees. So I think this was a good effort, at least good step to do that. Because again, they yielded a lot of good data, but they just didn't analyze it adequately. And there was no real shift in policy or strategy based upon the data that was coming in, or even the fact that some people were, expressing skepticism and things, concerning the data. So I guess they did about the best job that they could have, but I think it goes back to that final kind of quote too at the end. Data is great, but it's only as good as how it's used and if it's used effectively or not. So I think there was a lot of good data generated, it was just not used very effectively.
Thank you. I spent 1972 in Thailand, and at the end of 72, they redeployed a lot of heavy bombing, et cetera, for linebacker, which seems very counterintuitive to this Hamlet by Hamlet thing. In your opinion, was that driven at all by statistical analysis, or is this just throw up your hands and say, well, here's something we haven't tried yet?
Are you talking like in 1972, the use of?
The end of 72.
Okay.
They redeployed a lot of heavy bombing.
Okay.
B-52s, F-111s,
Right.
and they were going to saturate bombing, I guess, North Vietnam more than anything.
Yes, well, that was just essentially to force Hanoi back to the negotiating table. They kind of punked Kissinger a little bit in, I think, October, November, in which they said, yeah, you know, yeah, we'll sign the agreement. All right, we agree to these terms. Kissinger comes back to the U.S. and says, I forget which one, pieces at hand, or I forget Chamberlain's quote and then Kissinger's quote, but it was something very much like that, right? And what happens is that they walk away from the bargaining table. He looks embarrassed, so that the Nixon administration does linebacker and linebacker two, just simply because all the stops were pulled at that point. Lyndon Johnson, the strategic air campaign against the North was highly carefully calibrated for fear of a wider war. Westmoreland, as a theater commander, had no control over the air assets, right? All those things were run through the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, then to the White House. And they were picking and choosing, yeah, you can hit this, now you can't hit that. Again, they wanted to do these kind of pinpoint attacks to try to convince Hanoi to give up. And they feared a wider war, so they kind of pulled their punches. After Tet, Johnson discontinues the strategic bombing campaign, and it pretty much stays that way, although, you know, Nixon does stuff in Cambodia, secret bombing campaign. But it's not until linebacker and linebacker two that strategic bombing campaign is kind of resurrected, if you will. So it sits dormant for quite a few years, but that was really just an effort to get them to the negotiating table so the U.S. can get the hell out of Dodge on terms that we were hoping would keep the South alive. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, you got one more, sir? Do we have time for one more? I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll take one more.
Okay.
So has the data analysis and collection changed much since Vietnam? I mean, you look at Afghanistan and what we did there, did the data collection change very much, or were they still looking after subjective targets? Because the outcomes were very similar.
Yes, no, that's a great question. I would say the methods themselves did not change. It still took human beings going into villages to ask the Afghans questions related to security or development, whatever it might be. I would just say simply that the volume and speed with which that information could be processed is that much quicker. But there were also instances of same stuff, manipulation, just kind of fudging the numbers to show progress, ambiguity about what they were supposed to put down. They weren't sure, is it A or B? I don't know, okay, B, we'll just put B down, right? That kind of stuff. And there's a great book, I forget who the author is, it's called The Afghanistan Papers. And when I read that, I saw a lot of the same issues with trying to gauge security and gathering data to determine security levels to be almost, you know, the same kind of problems that plagued in Vietnam you saw in Afghanistan as well, too. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.